we were able to reduce the total amount of time on road by 48%. So just think about that, like 48% reduction in the amount of drive time and a 36% reduction in the number of kilometers. And that resulted in about a 15% reduction in the number of trucks required.
This is episode 92 of the Resilient Supply Chain Podcast, formerly known as the Sustainable Supply Chain Podcast. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm your host, Tom Raftery, and welcome to a brand new chapter for the show. If you've been with me for a while, you'll know that this podcast began life as the Digital Supply Chain Podcast, then evolved into the Sustainable Supply Chain Podcast as sustainability became the beating heart of every conversation. And now the world has shifted again. Climate shocks, AI disruption, new regulation, and global instability have made one thing crystal clear. A supply chain can't be sustainable unless it's resilient, and it can't be resilient unless it's sustainable. So this isn't a pivot, it's a progression. The conversations, the guests, the mission all remain the same, but the lens has sharpened. We'll still explore decarbonisation, digital transformation, and ethical operations, but with a renewed focus on how resilience underpins it all. From data integrity and diversification to circular design and climate-ready strategies. So, welcome to the Resilient Supply Chain Podcast. Same host, same curiosity, even sharper purpose. And what better way to kick things off than with a guest who lives at the intersection of optimization, AI, and sustainability. Rich Savoie, co-founder and CEO of Adiona, joining us from Sydney to talk about last-mile logistics, fleet electrification, and how data-driven optimization can cut emissions while improving efficiency. Rich, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I would. Thanks, Tom. I really appreciate you having me on. My name is Richard Savoie. I'm a co-founder and CEO of a company called Adiona, and we're based here in Sydney, Australia. And we do optimization for medium and large enterprise supply chain and fleets. And my background is in engineering, but my passion is in commercializing research. So I have a wonderful research team that are a bunch of algorithmic developers, and my job is to commercialize their AI so that the supply chain world can use it to be more sustainable and efficient.
Fantastic. And that's not a very strong Australian accent I'm hearing there, Rich.
If I tried to do an Australian accent, you would definitely not think it was Australian. You'd probably think I was losing my mind. So good pickup, Tom. I'm from Boston, and I've been in Australia for about 15 years, though.
Oh, great. What brought you there?
My wife, she got an offer for a job for a 1-year contract. And of course, that 1-year contract turned into 2, turned into 3, turned into dual citizenship and kids now.
Fantastic. Great. And tell me about Adiona, Rich. You're the founder and CEO. So what made you decide that you needed to set up Adiona?
Well, a quick story, a quick bit of background that people usually find kind of interesting is my background is in medical devices. That's where I really started my career. I was in electrical engineering, building cardiology and cardiovascular devices for some big companies like Medtronic, the biggest medical device company in the world, as well as some others. And when I moved here to Sydney, I started leading a small cardiology company. When I say small, about 25 people, but doing big things, exporting to 45 countries through big distributors like Boston Scientific and Johnson & Johnson. And I really fell in love with entrepreneurship and running that small business on behalf of its cardiologist founder. And I realized that it was the right time for me to step out and do my own thing. Now, not being from supply chain specifically, or at least it's definitely not from the transport side of supply chain, I'd been around manufacturing my entire career, understood that part of it very well. But I had some other ideas around workforce optimization. So my sister has always worked in retail, and she would commute past 3 instances of the same grocery chain to get to the one that she worked at, simply because that's the one that had the job when she was looking. And if you think about that at scale, there's a massive inefficiency in the workforce. And I can go on and on and on about that, which I will spare you. But at the end of the day, it was the first attempt at building a company around an optimization framework that I thought would bring not only societal benefits from people having to commute less, but also all the flow on effects like reduced congestion on the road network, reduced emissions due to transport. And through the validation of that business, I learned that there's actually a much bigger opportunity in supply chain and logistics. We realized, that there's a massive efficiency gap that can be closed, especially using modern AI tools. And my co-founder, who is a PhD in optimization mathematics and computer science, was really instrumental in helping us build the first framework to actually start to test it out in the market. And then it became a growing company.
Fantastic. And you've worked with some big brands. What's the real bottleneck for them in last mile delivery today?
Well, we spoke before. Adiona recently brought on Australia Post as a client, which for people who aren't from Australia, it's far away from everything. So it tends to be pretty isolated, and that's a challenge in its own way. But it's also enormously large. The continent of Australia is about the same size as the continental US. And so we have this tyranny of distance where you have an enormous amount of territory to cover for a postal organization. And you've got this incredibly inverted mix of dense cities and completely remote regional areas. So it's a very challenging place to optimize freight and transport because of the different conditions. And we'd already been on market and doing some work for companies like Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Amazon DSPs, all sorts of interesting companies. And Australia Post realized that they needed newer, better route optimization. And that was really their impetus for going to market, is there was some pull at the high level that they needed to reinvest in optimizing their transport network, especially the road transport. And they did a global search, a global technology search. And they evaluated hands-on evaluation of 12 different platforms from around the world. And luckily, they realized that the best technology was right here in their backyard in Australia. So now the focus is on us to then get that message out there and get in front of all these other large logistics companies and fleets.
And you were the best based on what criteria?
Well, there's obviously been a long history of optimization technologies in supply chain. Your listeners will know lots about the types of technologies that have come before. And since the cloud computing revolution in the late 2000s, early 2010s and whatnot, it enabled a newer breed of technology to come about. And some of the problems that we're solving in the optimization space are that traditional solutions were very constrained by computation power. Optimization is a very computationally heavy thing to do. And so you need big computers, you need heavy horsepower processors, and you need to be able to manipulate big data, especially for an organization like a postal organization that does nearly 1 billion parcels a year. So that was always a limit, but cloud compute made some improvements to availability there. And then native AI development allows us to then also parallel process things in ways that weren't really feasible before, after GPS became available. So we're really addressing some of the scale problems that traditional optimization solutions would hit the wall against. Companies that were used to trying to create an optimal plan for their distribution and having to run a software solution overnight used to be kind of the norm for, if you're doing a few thousand deliveries. And now they can do that in minutes with a platform like ours. But also it's the quality. As the saying goes, garbage in, garbage out. And so access to good data sources for optimization was very hard to get as well. If the mapping data that you might use in a traditional route optimization solution was typically a static set of maps that sits in a basement server and does not get updated very often, kind of like the maps in your car, right? When it's asking you to pay some money to update the maps. Now we have access to global data sources with real-time traffic, historical traffic profiles, and driving duration from point to point rather than just distance. So we can do so much more in terms of accurate and efficient optimization with these new data sources than could be done before. That's another type of problem that we're solving.
Okay. Rich, last mile is the shortest part of the supply chain, but the most expensive and carbon intensive. So why is it still so hard to get that right?
Yeah, it is, according to World Economic Forum, 53% of the total cost of transport is in that last mile piece. And, another kind of shocking stat is that As the grid decarbonizes in a lot of countries worldwide, transport has always been the second largest emitter, but it's on track to be the largest emitter by 2030. And a lot of that has to do also with e-commerce growth, right? Countries all over the world have modernized their e-commerce, and now the amount of product shipments has grown extremely quickly. So even companies that are trying to do their best to be more sustainable, they're investing in things like sustainable packaging, they're investing in better reusable materials and all sorts of great initiatives to make their supply chain and transport piece more sustainable. It tends to be a pretty linear relationship between how much product you put on a truck and how many carbon molecules you emit out of the back of that truck. So it's become a very difficult problem for them to solve. And we help them do it in a few different ways. One is simply with visibility. So by building in carbon emissions measurement, simulation, and reporting, it allows a manufacturer or a transporter to know what their emissions profile looks like realistically. And that's super
Okay.
important, especially for a manufacturer who doesn't actually run the transport. They rely on a third-party logistics or four-party logistics to do it. They need to get that data back from that carrier in order to know what the emissions are. But using our platform, they can create a digital twin of it and then know effectively what the emissions are when they engage with that carrier. And that also then allows them to look at simulation. How do you then invest in cleaner vehicles, cleaner drivetrains, less vehicles where you can get away with it, core optimization that can bring down the amount of kilometers that you need to traverse and then bring down your emissions. And then the final piece is electric vehicle native tools, the ability to use one platform to run your traditional diesel and petrol vehicles, no problem. But then we have tools so that when they are ready to start experimenting with lower emissions vehicles like electric or hydrogen, they can do that all within the same platform.
I noticed on your website you've got a workbook and also a workshop to help people move to EVs. Can you talk me through some of the things that are in that? Because I didn't sign up to download it, to be, I'm completely honest, so I didn't get a look at it. But what can people learn from that?
I'll send you a copy, Tom. Don't worry.
Great.
It runs through a number of strategies. And first of all is highlighting the importance of commercial vehicle electrification, especially in the context of what I just talked about with transport emissions being so substantial and being so material. It's also the fact that commercial vehicles run longer than a passenger vehicle. They travel more than a passenger vehicle. The utilization is huge. So actually, by investing in optimizing and transitioning them to EVs, there's more bang for buck there. Like the sustainability improvements you can make and the emissions avoidance and abatement you can make is really significant with commercial fleets generally. And like here
Yeah.
in Australia, articulated trucks like big rigs, semis, those types of very large vehicles, class 8 and whatnot, are only 1% of the vehicle population, but they're responsible for 15% of the emissions. So what we talk about in the workbook and in the workshops is that when you're looking at optimizing and moving to EVs, that's the right time to right size your fleet. And there's a bit of method behind that very simple statement. Right sizing your fleet, especially in the context of EVs, is so important because oftentimes it's looked at like a one-to-one swap. I've got a diesel delivery van that's operating in the metro area, and I'm just going to swap it with an EV that has the best range, and I'm off to the races. That is absolutely poor strategy because it's going to lead to the most expensive outcome, and it's going to lead to broken hearts when those vans don't necessarily live up to their diesel counterparts, and there's all sorts of problems. So expectation management is really important in there, and it's also so important to take the time to really analyze your network and say, where are the right places where EVs could be dropped in as a direct replacement? But where are the other places where we might need to reorganize the network, reoptimize, and ideally reduce the vehicle count so that we have more money, more capital available to invest in new vehicles? We think it's a really holistic thing that you need to step through. And another key part that you'll see when I send you your copy is stakeholder management, because oftentimes these programs, while they have a lot of support at the boardroom, nobody's willing to pay too high of a carbon premium. And by carbon premium, I mean supply chain companies operate on thin margins on a good day, right? There's a lot of CapEx, a lot of OpEx. And so if you're trying to tell your business that we should invest in being more sustainable, but it's going to cost us 40% more per consignment, it's not going to happen. There's just no way. So that idea of bringing people at different points and different stakeholders in so that they understand that this can be financially efficient, it can lead to better financial outcomes as well as the sustainability outcomes, is so critical to getting the support that you need to actually then go and do the implementation.
And you got to think as well, it depends a lot on the cost of the different fuels for vehicles. If I'm saying that, because you need to justify the ROI to move to EVs as well. And in just talking about my own case locally here in Spain, my cheap rate for electricity is 8 cents per kilowatt hour. My battery in my vehicle is quite large. It's an 80 kilowatt hour battery. So to fill the tank of that car is €6.40, and the range of the car is around 530 kilometres. So the economics of that are quite good, especially considering that a similar sized vehicle would be paying around €1.50 for a litre of diesel. And let's say it gets, I don't know, make the maths easy, 5 litres per 100 kilometres. Suddenly you're looking at 750 per 100 kilometres. No, that's wrong. No, that's right. 750 per 100 kilometres times 5 is 40 something euros versus my 640. So it's, in that case, the economics work quite well on the operating costs, but that's not the same everywhere, is it?
Exactly right. So that breakdown of spend and the electricity cost is going to be very different depending on whether you're already in an area that's using a sustainable or renewable grid. It's going to be dependent on load times and when you charge. For commercial operations, there's a lot of investment in algorithms to arbitrage those prices, which we're kind of aligned with, but it's not something that we do directly. And to your point, like you really need to pick the right vehicle and understand when and where to charge it in order to get that good ROI.
Yeah, and of course, if fuel costs are lower as well for petrol or diesel, it makes the economics more difficult to justify. And then maintenance costs as well on EVs are typically 50% of the maintenance costs of petrol or diesel. So it's another factor you got to work in as well. Anywho.
Yeah, there's a few trade-offs too. When you start to stack it up, there's also, like the interesting thing that I highlight to fleets sometimes, especially in the context of it being very hard to recruit for drivers and hard to recruit in supply chain generally in manufacturing. So, there's a massive labor shortage globally in those industries. So one of the things that I always remind people is that if you look at the stack of costs going into your total cost of ownership of a vehicle, at the top isn't fuel. At the top isn't insurance. At the top isn't maintenance. It's labor. It's the person that's driving the vehicle that actually drives the majority of the cost of that electric vehicle. And so, again, if you can optimize to the point where you can get rid of vehicles and do more with less, that's how you're going to actually save a lot more in proportion to the other costs.
What about the move to the likes of micro mobility and cargo bikes and things like that? Is that something you're seeing happening as well and something that you can help manage?
Yeah, I love cargo bikes. In fact, we started the first, and by started, I mean we enabled the company here in Australia called Parcel Point to set up a cargo bike network that was based out of convenience stores and news agencies. So it was a really cool model where they have a line haul with residential parcels mainly. They partner with the shops, and there's a few different models of this worldwide, where they partner with bodegas in Manhattan to do this and convenience stores in lots of places. So they go and they fill out the inventory of parcels. And then if the person doesn't collect that parcel from that location within 24 hours, the shop owner gets kind of cranky, doesn't want stale inventory sitting around that nobody's going to come and get, taking up space in their store. So then they dispatch a cargo bike rider to then take a bundle, put them on the cargo bike, and then go off into the local area and deliver them. And our algorithms powered that end to end. meaning that knowing what the parcel volume was going to be for the next day, they could figure out exactly what blocks of 10-ish parcels, a block being big enough to go on a cargo bike tray, would be bundled together and then put into satchels and then delivered as pre-made satchels to the convenience stores. Now, of course, customer comes and picks up a parcel. Cool, you just take it out of that block, and it means that there's less in there for the cargo bike rider. But that's cool. And then pre-made routes for all those cargo bike riders as well. So you get this really dynamic bike-based routing model that was really, really fun to build, and we're starting to see more take up of globally slowly.
Very nice, very nice. And if we look at trends then around emissions reporting, which is becoming mandatory in more markets, where do you see companies tripping up there, and where do you see as the biggest opportunity?
It's really interesting because for people who aren't familiar with the scope concepts of emissions, there's scope 1, 2, and 3. And that's a pretty internationally harmonized framework now that people think about emissions in. Scope 1 being the emissions that you create yourself. So if I'm a manufacturer that also does my own transport, all the vehicles that I own are going to make emissions, and I own those as scope 1. Scope 2 tends to be the electricity that you consume. So for all of your sites, you're not emitting that carbon directly, you're emitting it through your electricity company, wherever they're making the electricity. So that's your scope 2. Scope 3 is pretty much everything else, all the indirect emissions that you might be responsible for, which is really important if you're a manufacturer that's using a 3PL to do your deliveries on your behalf. Oftentimes what we find is that there's this big knowledge gap between a very large manufacturer who is on the hook for mandatory reporting to their local government, domestic government, and a smaller carrier who isn't necessarily on the hook to do any reporting at all. And so they're not really measuring their emissions. They're not really tracking that, especially at like a per consignment or a per pallet level. And so now their customer is getting a bit salty because they need to get that data to then do their mandatory reporting. And if they don't, the shareholders are going to be very upset when they get a fine over it. So you can see that it's a very quickly moving market that's growing and maturing very quickly. But what we see is the ability to bridge that gap is possible through these simulation and modeling techniques where the manufacturer can at least get an idea of what that carrier is doing and then give them the guidance to say, okay, here's the exact data that I need. I've kind of shown it to you. I've shown you exactly what you need to provide me. There's no ambiguity to it. And we kind of help them to all do that.
Nice. Okay. AI and machine learning are the flavor of the day or the year or the last couple of years. They're often powering this new wave of routing. What's changed in the last 5 years that's made this tech so much more effective? I mean, you're not using LLMs, right?
No, we don't use LLMs. In fact, as I think I mentioned, my co-founder is a PhD in optimization mathematics and machine learning. We started using AI that he'd been using in his research early on, but it was more around hardcore optimization and clustering. But then we started investing in building deep learning models that could normalize the data. So effectively, something that modern LLMs are very, very good at, and in fact, better than what we developed. So it's an interesting world where now I think a lot of companies that are quite skilled in AI have to choose, well, what do we build and what do we buy? And we've had to be more shrewd about that as well. And I think that there is a massive opportunity for AI, especially when you look at agentic AI, vibe coding, for organizations to start to build things to use themselves and not necessarily rely on external solutions, external vendors. So if I'm a big supply chain company right now, and all I need is a CRM for my team of sales reps to go out and manage their work, I'll probably build that myself. I don't need to spend money on that. And it's so possible with AI. But then if there's other things in my business that are much more deep, regulated, niche, finance being a great option, like I'm not going to go and build my own payroll system using AI. It's too risky. And the solution providers have spent their entire life's work building something that's compliant and reliable, right? There's this really interesting shakeup of how the solutions market is going to play out because we can use AI for all sorts of other cool things in supply chain that people can't replicate because it requires access to data. And it sounds almost like the same thing we were talking about 10, 15 years ago, where data is so valuable and it's the key. Well, it turns out that in an AI world, that's still true. We're building AI that has a closed loop feedback so that everything that happens in the field, every proof of delivery event, every geofence break that logs where the vehicle is at, every change an allocator or a dispatcher makes to a route plan, all of that is fed back into our system. And then we use AI to hyper fine tune the routing for each individual client in each individual area. You cannot create a general purpose LLM style neural net that can do that effectively with a huge diversity of the stuff that different supply chain and delivery operations do. But in specialist hands like ours, you can create these really hyper specific models that do allow you to get a massive benefit out of AI, but it's really specialized per organization.
Right. I had a chap on the podcast, Dr. Eric Garcelle, a couple of months back, talking about quantum computing. And it was his contention on that episode that one of the big use cases for quantum computing is optimization, that it's way, way better than AI for that kind of thing, particularly. Is that something you're looking at as well, the move towards quantum computing?
Yeah, I'm going to age myself a little bit, Tom. I actually did my undergrad capstone thesis project on quantum computing back in 2001, and it felt like it was just around the corner. And we're now nearly officially 25 years later, and it's definitely advanced a lot, but it's far from being a household dinner table conversation, right? But I think Eric is very wise to point out optimization because, the top three things I think that people talk about routinely when it comes to quantum and the applicability of quantum computing in real practical situations is cryptography, the fact that it can potentially solve and or encode encryption very, very quickly compared to a standard computer, navigation. So Australia is a mining country. We have these amazing magnetic maps of the entire country with the magnetic field, and you can actually use quantum transceivers to navigate without GPS based on the magnetic signature of the Earth.
Wow.
And I'm talking like hyper fine navigation. So it's really cool. And then optimization. And optimization is because, as I mentioned, the compute power for traditional computers to do optimization is really intense. There's so many different permutations and options that you have to solve through to find which one's most efficient. Quantum has the ability to do that in a much more parallelized way, based in the nature of having three states instead of two. So in theory, it's going to be the panacea for optimization. But what we see in practically is that the hardware has not evolved to a level of stability to allow us to solve optimization problems at scale to make a real, because the biggest advancements are things where you start looking at big numbers. That's where you're going to get the best benefit out of quantum. But we will have an announcement hopefully soon in the next few months, maybe, to circle back to you about a partnership that we're working on that will allow us to pilot some of the first quantum routing technology in the world.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Definitely get back to me when you make that announcement. I'd be fascinated. How then do you balance the likes of machine-driven efficiency with the day-to-day realities of human drivers, customer needs, unpredictable traffic, et cetera, et cetera?
It's part of our North Star goal that we've always wanted to create this triple win, where businesses can be more financially efficient, we can reduce emissions, and then we can develop what we call humanistic AI. And that humanistic AI is to never take your focus off of making sure that you're improving the actual day-to-day life of the workforce. So these people that are on the front lines in warehouses and delivery drivers. And you're also providing value to the end customers, the people receiving it, whether it's a residential parcel drop or whether it's a cafe getting a delivery of milk. You want to make sure that the experience improves rather than gets worse because of the technology. And I think that's something that's been a really good guiding light for us, because we do take really seriously the risk impact of any change or any feature that we deploy. Yes, this is going to make this one user happy because they can do this one thing, but what is the flow-on effect? Is it going to make it harder for the driver to do their job? Is it going to make it, the ETA less predictable or what have you? So that's something that's really important. The other thing, to answer your question, is that all of our best ideas typically come from our customers. The ones I like to talk about is for high density parcel couriers. In a city, you want to park the minimum number of times and then do as much work on foot as possible with a two-wheel dolly or with a satchel or whatever. And most software solutions, for some reason, have still missed the brief on that, and they route them point to point to point to point to point to point to point. And we said, well, this is what humanistic AI should do. How do we build a model that actually looks for minimal parking locations, maximum density on foot, and then prioritizes those so that you get the best blend of efficiency and doing exactly what the courier wants to do. And I think that's something that's going to keep AI relevant in our lives as something that augments us rather than replaces or annoys us.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. You're based in Australia, but you're obviously looking into Europe and the Americas. What's the biggest difference in how these markets approach last mile sustainability?
Well, Europe has always been on the forefront. They've created a lot of the frameworks that we use to do emissions calculations and reporting globally. The first carbon emissions measurement APIs for fleets came out of Europe, and I think there's always been a great focus on it there. So the bar is very high, and every country has its own kind of specialty and own way of approaching those frameworks. And that makes it a very complicated market. It requires basically a country by country approach to look at these things from what we've seen. Then you look at places like North America, where there's not a significant difference between how the technology stack and the regulatory stack operates between Canada and the US. Yes, there are differences, but at the end of the day, they're not as material as the ones in Europe. And then, another market that we're investing in is Southeast Asia, because you have this massive growth in e-commerce and delivery operations generally, and you've got a rapidly maturing road network and data infrastructure network that makes it a great place to make a really big impact really fast.
And which regulatory or market shifts will most accelerate sustainable last mile adoption in the next 3 to 5 years, do you think?
It depends on a few things, but I think from a sustainability perspective, electrifying the fleets is the best thing that we can do. And we certainly got a lot of traction on that. And, Europe has done very well. And you look at places like Norway, where EVs are like 97% of new sales, that's Europe is leading the way by far there. But in other markets like Australia, it's just been very slow to get traction because the regulators have not really provided significant incentives, and they've not mandated things. Like, I don't know how much of your audience might know this, but Australia was one of only a few countries in the world without a fuel efficiency standard for vehicles, for any vehicle. So, the rest of the world is just dumping their worst, least efficient, most polluting vehicles in Australia because it's a very good market. It's a great automotive market. A lot of people to buy cars here with money, and there's no regulation on the emissions, so they can just chuck whatever they want. And so you can imagine that. Now, I say there is none. I mean, there was none. They've just started implementing it now. But this is something that even in the US has been around for nearly 30 years, and in Europe for longer than that. So yeah, Australia's way behind the 8 ball here, which is almost an opportunity for us because we're looking at these best practices from Europe. We're looking at the winners in markets like the US and Canada, and then we're trying to apply that knowledge here and do a bit of, if you build it, they will come. Because they will come. They'll follow with the rest of the world, but it'll just take a little bit longer.
If you were designing the perfect EV transition pilot for a delivery fleet, what would you say are kind of the must-haves?
To be really careful about vehicle choice. Don't just believe what the OEMs tell you. Think really, really hard about what payload you need and what range you need, and then also look at some of the details that make EVs very different from ICE, internal combustion engine vehicles. They can't operate on as steep of a grade. They can get stuck on steep grades. the battery depletes much faster under payload than running empty. Temperature is a big impact, whether you're operating in a really cold environment or a really hot environment, both of them will affect your battery consumption. So take a really hard look at the types of vehicles that you're going to pilot, and then work with a trusted infrastructure partner. Always make sure that they have a relationship with the grid provider that you're on. You don't want to be the first one that this infrastructure company is trying to negotiate on the grid with, and make sure that they have a really deep and clear understanding of your requirements operationally. Meaning, if I'm Australia Post, or I'm a parcel courier, I might be operating 3 shifts around the clock, and that makes charging much more difficult at cheap times or at any time, right? Likewise, if I'm a refrigerated, fast-moving consumer goods company, I've got to run reefers. I need to worry about refrigeration depleting my vehicles as well. And if my charge partner just doesn't understand that, which, trust me, sometimes they don't, that could be really catastrophic. And so all those things, really clear understanding. Don't treat it like a flight of fancy, like it's an interesting thing to do. Treat it like something that actually you want to succeed.
Can you walk us through a real fleet you've worked with and what the before and after looked like?
Yeah, well, when we first started here in Australia, one of the first companies that we started working with was Coca-Cola Amatil, which is the bottler here in Asia Pacific. They were acquired by CCEP, Coca-Cola Europe Pacific Partners. When we first built the first version of our platform, they were the pilot customer. And we were all a bit stunned with the early results, because for one of their direct-to-consumer fleets, running more than 100 trucks nationally, we were able to reduce the total amount of time on road by 48%. So just think about that, like 48% reduction in the amount of drive time and a 36% reduction in the number of kilometers. And that resulted in about a 15% reduction in the number of trucks required. So big trucks, big money, 6 figures operating cost per truck per year, being able to reduce that by 15%. And then the emissions were effectively, very similar to the kilometer reduction. So about a 36% reduction in the related emissions, all to do the same amount of work. So it allowed them to reinvest in their network, reinvest in their drivers, and reinvest in the future of their business.
Sounds like a very short ROI. If you could wave a magic wand and fix one thing about global delivery systems tomorrow, what would that be?
Only one. I'm only allowed one. I think it would really be about transparency of data, being able to see data at every leg of a journey, of an item, of a parcel, of a raw material, seamlessly from end to end, because the inability to see through that and to have that visibility really creates a massive onflow of problems, like a butterfly effect of problems, where every time someone needs to inquire or wonder or challenge where something is, there is an inefficiency that's created there. And every little inefficiency that's created along that journey, which could be tens, hundreds, thousands of questions that are created about where something is or a shipment, that inefficiency effect is massive. It's very difficult to measure. Even in parcel shipment world, what we call the POD, the proof of delivery, it's this one simple data point that people are constantly chasing and questioning and referring to. And it's the reason that your courier takes a photo when they leave something, because that one single piece of information, having it transparent, visible, and interrogatable, being able to interrogate it from end to end at any time, creates a massive efficiency increase that you just can't get otherwise.
Okay. A left field question for you, Rich. If you could have any person or character, alive or dead, real or fictional, as a champion for last mile sustainability, who would it be and why?
Anyone alive or dead as a champion for sustainability? Well, I think we talked about
Real or
how.
fictional?
Well, yeah, that's a great point, because our name Adiona is inspired by the Roman goddess of the return journey, and I think I might have mentioned that at the beginning. So circling right back around, there is almost this mythical proportion that we need to defer to. Our existence on this planet is something that we can't take for granted, and it is something that's bigger than us. It's literally existential to the truest definition. So I almost feel like if you were to give me that option, I would invoke a god or goddess like character that has a bigger than life, beyond the realm of reality type presence to really help people understand that what we're dealing with here is beyond ourselves. It's whether we live or die, the earth will still be here. If we ruin the terraform here, the earth will still persist and life will probably march on, but we won't be here to see it. And we are notoriously self-destructive. We're notoriously unable to see the big picture, and that's okay. That's part of who we are and how we got to where we are today. But if I wanted one person, it would be maybe Adiona, the goddess of the return journey, to swoop down from the heavens and scare the pants off people to get them to be serious about this.
Great. I love it. Super. Rich, we're coming towards the end of the podcast now. Is there any question I haven't asked that you wish I had, or any aspect of this we haven't touched on that you think it's important for people to be aware of?
No, Tom, I think you've done a fantastic job of really teasing through the edges of this. I guess the only thing I can add is that I'm easy to find. So if people want to seek me out on LinkedIn or send me an email, they're more than welcome to. I really do enjoy talking about this stuff and having discourse and debate. So if anybody disagrees with me, I also encourage them to reach out and challenge me in any way, because that's how we all grow.
Okay, fantastic. So I'll put those links, the links to your LinkedIn account, and I assume the Adiona website in the show notes so that everyone has access to them. Fantastic. Rich, that's been really interesting. Thanks a million for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Tom. It was really fun.